I'm Dr. Musil, and welcome to Lecture 9, Negative Responsibility and Moral Integrity, where we discuss utilitarianism through a discussion of Kai Nielsen and Bernard Williams and their kind of back and forth battle that they had, if you will, in the philosophical journals decades ago when they were discussing utilitarianism. Kai Nielsen, I alluded to this at the end of Lecture 8 in the middle lecture. Kai Nielsen is a contemporary defender, contemporary philosopher. He's still alive, I believe. I think he teaches up in Canada, or was teaching up in Canada at least until relatively recently. Contemporary philosopher, so recent, right? We talked about Bentham and Mill. They were before our time, modern philosophers. But Nielsen is a contemporary defender of utilitarianism, and then Bernard Williams was one of his contemporaries as well, so he's also a contemporary philosopher. Bernard Williams is actually really well known. I'll talk more about him, I guess, when we get to the second part of this lecture. So this is the first part where we'll talk about Kai Nielsen primarily. But Bernard Williams is known primarily or very well in Nietzschean scholarship, Friedrich Nietzsche, so he was a Nietzsche scholar. And that's how I came to know Bernard Williams quite a bit, was through my classes on Nietzsche. But come to find out, then, Williams and Nielsen have this discussion, very famous sort of back and forth about utilitarianism as well. So that's what we're going to be discussing. Again, this first part of the lecture, we're going to focus on the idea of negative responsibility and what Kai Nielsen has to say in defense of utilitarianism. Because he is basically, in the vein of Mill before him, addressing criticisms of utilitarianism. And actually, he is specifically addressing the criticisms of Bernard Williams. So, and we'll see what Williams' main criticisms are in the second part of the lecture, then when we turn our attention to what Williams had to say. And I think I mentioned this at the end of the last lecture, but once we finish this part of the lecture, then we will transition. So starting with the second part of Lecture 9, the next video, we'll transition then to sort of our focus being away from directly focusing on utilitarianism and instead focusing on the criticisms of it, and then, deontology. So we'll still talk about utilitarianism, but again, more indirectly, because we're focusing on deontology. Of course, they're going to be criticizing all the time what the utilitarians say, so we'll still be talking about utilitarianism quite a bit. But I just wanted to point out that we are kind of then transitioning. This will be a kind of our last video where we're focusing on what the utilitarians tell us, and then from this point forward, after this video, right, we'll switch it around and focus more on the deontologist end of the spectrum, if you will. So hopefully that made sense. Slide 2. Who is Kai Nielsen? I kind of already alluded to him. He's primarily concerned with, again, addressing the criticisms advanced towards utilitarianism, very much like Mill and what we discussed in Lecture 8 when we talked about what Mill had to say with respect to, for example, the allegation that utilitarianism is a doctrine worthy only of swine. Nuh-uh, said Mill, for all the reasons we talked about in Lecture 8. Anyway, so he specifically, as he says on page 281, he's responding to those critics, and he has in mind people like Elizabeth Anscombe, I think he referenced, and obviously Bernard Williams as well, responding to people like these who suggest that quote, that any consequentialist view of ethics has monstrous implications, which makes such a conception of morality untenable, end quote. And I should point out that Nielsen, a lot of times you might have noticed in the reading, tends to talk in terms of consequentialism. But remember, again, go back to Lecture 7, the beginning of the Bentham lecture. That's very critically important. When we fleshed out what utilitarianism is, we juxtaposed it, or sort of described it as being consequentialist. And we fleshed out, those terms, right? The relationship between utilitarianism and consequentialism, right? And mentioned that all utilitarians are consequentialists. Okay? They're emphasizing what matters morally are the consequences. That makes them consequentialists. Okay? And then they specify particular types of consequences that matter. That's why they're a particular version of consequentialism, right? Specifically, happy ones. That's what matters. Okay? And so what you need to understand here is Nielsen then is in discussing consequentialism and defending the merits of consequentialism in general. He's so too then defending the merits of one of its particular versions, utilitarianism. And so I just want to point that out. He does oftentimes talk in terms of consequentialism, not specifically utilitarianism, but he's defending all versions of consequentialism in doing so and saying, hey, look, it's not monstrous to focus on what results from actions. That's just to say that that's what matters morally. And that's what he's up to here. That's his project then, is to suggest why, again, those suggesting this, right, that any consequentialist view of ethics has monstrous implications, that's wrong. And in fact, he's going to suggest that the opposite, the deontologists, these guys, the moral absolutists, they're the ones whose moral theory leads us to monstrous implications, not the utilitarians or more generally the consequentialists. Okay? This leads him to say, this is in the bottom of slide 2, quote, so from quoting from page 281 of our textbook, quote, when its implications are thought through, this is him describing the critic, and the critic's issue with utilitarianism or consequentialism more generally. It has been forcefully argued it will be seen actually to have inhumane and morally intolerable implications. So again, that's what the critic is suggesting of consequentialism, that it's going to have these morally intolerable implications. And so his task, Nielsen, turning to slide 3, is to address that suggestion, and he's going to suggest, no, that's not the case. And in fact, these guys, are the ones that lead us down the road to terrible consequences or monstrous implications, as they put it. So I do want to point out, so there's a lot of terms here that I think we would want to unpack, and that we're going to unpack as we go here. So, who are the bad guys, so to speak, from Nielsen's perspective? So he's defending, right, utilitarianism, but then more generally consequentialism. I tried to mention, that's what I was getting to a moment ago. And on the opposite end, who he's addressing, right, are these critics who are suggesting that his camp, the consequentialists, yield monstrous implications. Well, who are the critics? Who is the opposition? The deontologists, or who he refers to as the moral absolutists, and at other times the moral conservativists. Okay, so I just want to point out moral absolutism. What he means by moral absolutism. What he means by moral conservatism. They're interchangeable. It's the same thing as deontology. Okay? These all reference the same cluster of views, as he might say, okay? Which are at odds then with his own camp, which are the consequentialists and the utilitarians. Okay. So again, we want to simplify things as much as possible. I don't think it helps that these authors at times refer to the same thing in numerous ways. So we'll have another one. He talks about these common sense moral intuitions. We also references them as common sense moral reactions. He also calls them common sense moral convictions. They're all the same thing. Okay, more on that in a moment. So moral absolutists are one and the same as the moral conservatives, are one and the same as the deontologists. Okay, they are in the opposite end. Okay, they are opposed to what he and his camp are saying. They maintain, right, the opposition. These guys, this camp, this is what I'm getting to on this bullet point, quoted from page 281. They maintain that, quote, there is a privileged moral principle or cluster of moral principles prescribing determinate actions with which it would always be wrong not to act in accordance no matter what the consequences. And so that's kind of the gist of this camp, right? The idea is we have these certain moral standards and they apply absolutely, hence moral absolutism, for example. Don't lie, period. Doesn't matter what the particular circumstances or consequences might be. That's sort of a moral standard. And so the idea is this camp suggests whatever these moral standards are, they apply absolutely, and we don't need to consult experience in order to figure these standards out. We know them and they apply absolutely, and their application doesn't hinge on any element of our experience or what our circumstances and our experience might be. Rather, they just apply absolutely. No matter what your circumstances are, don't lie. Don't kill innocent people. Yada, yada, yada. Okay? That's this camp. And he's going to juxtapose his own position with theirs. And he wants to say, again, the consequences of utilitarians. No, that's not how they proceed. Right? It's not in this absolute sense. We have to, as opposed to what they say, we do have to consult experience. We have to analyze the particulars of the situation and figure out, of course, being consequentialist utilitarians, which particular course of action in the particular scenario will yield the greatest happiness for the greatest number. And by the way, he is an act utilitarian. Going back to the distinction between rule and act utilitarianism, Kai Nielsen is most definitely an act utilitarian. We have to analyze each particular instance. Okay. We mentioned that. So, what are you going to try to do then, right? Having set up this basic battle, right? It's him defending the utilitarians and the consequentialists versus this camp. And this camp, he's described their suggestion that his own camp, their moral theory, or utilitarianism and consequentialism, yields monstrous implications. So his strategy now is going to be to go through some examples that'll help highlight or illuminate this notion that no, in fact, we don't yield these monstrous implications, but in fact, you guys do, right? You're the one, through your lack of negative responsibility, if you will, more on that in a moment, you're the one that allows all these monstrous things to happen. So that's what his objective is here. So we're going to turn our attention then to, as I mentioned, he's going to go through some examples here to try to make his point. We're going to go ahead and do that then. So the first thing he talks about is this idea of a just war. And this comes out first. He starts talking about this first before he gets into his famous two hypothetical thought experiments here. So he wants to know, and he describes sort of the view of, I mentioned like Elizabeth Anscombe, some other philosophers. In their view, he wants to, just sort of characterize their stance, and he wants to know, quote, is it the case that anyone shows a corrupt mind if he defends such bombing of innocent people or innocent persons, when, horrible as it is, it will quite definitely lessen appreciably the total amount of suffering and death in the long run? And so, again, the suggestion is, right, he cites these people like Elizabeth Anscombe, who said, I don't even want to discuss anything with somebody who's willing to entertain the idea of bombing innocent people. They're just morally corrupt. Right? There's no reason to even engage in conversation with them. And he wants to know, well, is that true? Is it true that anybody that's willing to entertain this idea of bombing innocent individuals, that they're automatically on the face of it morally corrupt? Or might there be something to it? Could there be some defense of that position? And of course, he's going to say there is. Okay? So again, we're discussing this. Let's go ahead and erase this to give us a little bit more room here. So again, the critics, those bad guys from his position, right? The moral absolutists, the moral conservatives, the deontologists. Okay, they're suggesting of the consequentialists, people who are willing to entertain this idea of killing innocent people for whatever reason. Right? We ought to not even talk to them. They're just morally corrupt on the face of it. We ought not to even engage in discussion with them. And again, Nielsen will say, is that really true? And I want to point out there's this distinction here. So he does point out, look, does this really seem to be the case? He doesn't think it is the case. He thinks there's many cases where there doesn't seem to be moral corruption at hand when there's actually bombing of innocent individuals involved. And going to then slide 5, right, he wants to say, so that the suggestion was that anybody who entertains this idea of killing an innocent person for whatever reason, right, that they're morally corrupt, that's a much harsher accusation than simply saying somebody's morally mistaken. And so I wanted to point that out here. Right? We shouldn't even indulge in discussions with these people. They're just morally corrupt. And Nielsen wants to say, well, hold on a second. Not only is it the case that we're not morally corrupt. So think, what is this distinction? So it's one thing, like morally mistaken just means you have good intentions. You're trying to do the right thing, but you mess up, right? You make a mistake in judgment and choose the wrong action, right? So you screwed up. Morally corrupt is you don't have good intentions, right? You're evil, right? And so that's, again, a much harsher accusation. And Nielsen wants to say, no, not only is it the case that we're not morally corrupt, we're not even morally mistaken, okay? We're far from being evil and lacking good intentions. No, I mean, we're trying to do what's best. People who are willing, in other words, who are we? Utilitarians, consequentialists, people that are willing to entertain this idea that there is such a thing as just war. More on that here in a second. We're not morally corrupt. We don't have these evil intentions. And not only that, we actually are the ones suggesting the right course of action. If you have the ability, as terrible as it is, through bombing a certain city or whatever, right? And granted, there's going to be the loss of innocent lives involved, but if you have the ability to do that, and in doing that would prevent a much larger loss of lives, right? A much greater evil, and then you don't do that, that would be the wrong thing to do. He wants to say, so we're actually doing the right thing. We're not even morally mistaken, because that would be the greater thing to do, the better thing to do, rather, right? Avert the greater evil. So in situations where if we don't bomb, for example, this city where certain evil people are, and in doing so kill some innocent people, if we don't do that, then many more people are going to die, then that's the wrong decision. He wants to say the proper thing to do would be to bomb that's the city, despite the fact that there's going to be innocent lives lost. And presumably that was why the United States dropped the bombs on Japan. It was to thwart a land invasion down the road, which would have presumably led to much greater loss of life. Or at least that's the suggestion. So on the part of the people who then defend or buy into this idea of just war. So the point is that for people like moral absolutists, moral conservatives, people, deontologists, those guys, this is a contradiction in terms. There is no such thing as a just war. If by war, so we need to unpack this. If we mean by war, right? If in a war there's going to be the loss of innocent lives, okay? Assume that. Right? In any war, there's going to be the loss of innocent lives. And the idea is, what Nielsen's saying, is that there is no such thing as a just war for the bad guys, for the deontologists, the moral absolutists, the moral conservatives. There can be no such thing as a just war because it's never okay to kill an innocent person. So says the deontologists, the moral absolutists, the moral conservatives. But he wants to say, right, well, that would be mistaken on their part. And they're actually the ones that are doing the wrong thing here. And we utilitarians and consequentialists, we do entertain this idea of a just war. Again, and in situations where, in engaging in this war, despite the fact that it's going to yield the loss of innocent lives, we avert a much greater loss of lives that we would have had to deal with otherwise. That then would be his idea of a just war, right? The utilitarians and consequentialists, again, this makes sense to them because they don't have this idea that it's never okay to kill innocent people. We don't want to kill innocent people. He's very careful in how he proceeds here, right? It's not like, okay, they do this willy-nilly. No, it's, again, a measured sort of thing, and it's a last kind of resort. It's not something we want to do, but when your only options are, kill a couple thousand innocent people, dropping the bomb now, or 50,000, 100,000, a million people lose their lives later, then he wants to say, well, the just thing to do would be to drop the bomb or start the war, however you want to put it. Okay? And the idea is, again, the deontologists, the moral absolutists, the moral conservatives, no, that doesn't make sense. The idea of a just war is a contradiction in terms. So going back to this notion on the part of people like Elizabeth Anscombe and the moral conservatives who say they're not even going to indulge in conversation with somebody who entertains the idea of a just war, that killing an innocent person is ever okay. That such a person is morally corrupt. Again, he wants to say no, not necessarily. That's not necessarily the case, and this isn't even necessarily the case. Okay, these, in fact, right, they might not even be morally mistaken. It might be the proper thing to do to kill that innocent person, to engage in a just war, because in doing so, you might yield a lot less evil, if you will, or a lot less loss of lives. Okay, let's move on. So that's the first example here. And so again, in general, the idea is the utilitarians and consequentialists, this makes sense to them. It doesn't make sense to the opposition, the deontologists, the moral conservatives, the moral absolutists. And of course he thinks, well, again, this is going to be, them not allowing this idea, that's going to be one way in which, an example of a way in which they can yield monstrous implications then, right? Because they're going to allow 100,000 people to die instead of the 2,000 innocent people that might have died with this bomb, for example. Okay, so moving on to maybe his most famous hypothetical thought experiment here, the fat man in the cave example. So at this point, if we're doing this face-to-face, I'd have somebody explain what happens, right? So you need to go make sure you do the reading, know the situation. So they're wandering through the cave, right? Exploring, spelunking, or whatever. And the fat man is going to lead their way out. Lo and behold, he gets stuck in the mouth of the cave. His head is positioned just perfectly. It's specified, right? Nielsen specifies this just perfectly so that his head would be above the rising tide. He would survive if we don't blow him up or kill him. Right? He'll be discovered by the park ranger or whoever. He'll be fine if we don't kill him. But, right, with the rising tide, the water's going to seep in, and the 20 others behind him are going to drown. So, fortunately, Billy Bob in the back, he was carrying around that stick of dynamite for a reason all his life. Well, I knew I was carrying that around for a reason right here. I've got dynamite. Let's blow them up. So, they have dynamite, a stick of dynamite. Do they blast the fat man and save the 20 others? Or is it not okay to kill an innocent person? And this will go back and demonstrate again a way in which the utilitarians and consequentialists are in stark opposition to what the deontologists say. So in this situation, as Nielsen says, this is slide 6, essentially, quote, either they use the dynamite and blast the poor innocent fat man out of the mouth of the cave, or everyone else drowns, either one life or many lives. Now, the moral conservative, what are they going to choose? Again, they stick to a cluster of moral principles, right? And then it's never okay to stray from it. Doesn't matter what happens in our experience, right? So whatever those standards are, right? Don't lie, don't kill this person. They apply them across the board. And it doesn't matter what our situation is. Okay? We just, our duty is to apply these moral standards universally or absolutely. Okay? So that's why then the moral absolutist or the moral conservatist or the deontologist is going to choose, as Nielsen would say, many lives. Because it's not permissible to kill the innocent person. No matter what the circumstances are, it's not permissible to blow the fat man up. So in that situation, right, the deontologists, the moral absolutists, the moral conservatives, they allow the water to seep in. They don't kill the fat man. And they allow, right, 20 people to die, Nielsen wants to say. He wants to say, well, what's the right thing to do? Not that. It's not going to be that. It's going to be the opposite. Again, it's not something we're happy about. We exhaust all our other options. But if we have no choice, and those are the only two options left, you have, the ideal will be referenced as a negative responsibility. You have the duty or obligation then to ensure that the lesser of the evils happens. Now, he associates real quick the bad guys, the deontologists, the moral conservatives, the moral absolutists, their position, right, this undying absolute allegiance to these universal principles, with an unquestioning allegiance to what he calls our common sense moral intuitions, common sense moral reactions, common sense moral convictions. He calls them all three of these different things. So remember this, okay? So our common sense moral intuitions, or our common sense moral reactions, or our common sense moral convictions are all the same thing, okay? They're all referencing what? What is this? Our natural, unreflective response to the situation. So, in other words, it's this is the important part, right? Unreflective. It's our immediate sort of gut response to a situation. Killing this person? No. Tell a lie? No. Right? So it's just immediate without further reflection. What is your immediate, natural, unreflective response to the dilemma or to the question or whatever? So in the fat man in the cave example, he would say our common sense moral intuition or common sense moral reaction or common sense moral conviction in that scenario is don't kill an innocent person. Right? Don't kill an innocent person. That's our immediate reaction to the situation. It's not okay to kill an innocent person. And the whole reason why he's bringing this up is because his point is, well, hey, sometimes the onus is on us, right? Or not sometimes. We always ought to reflect further on these immediate gut responses to these situations. We always ought to reflect. Because sometimes if we act just on these all the time, we're going to do the wrong thing. And he's saying this is exactly what the moral absolutists, moral conservatives, and deontologists, this is always what they do. They just always go with what our immediate sort of gut response to the situation is, right? They never reflect further. And so his point is, if you don't question these, like the deontologist does in the cave example, then you're going to allow 20 people to drown, right? Because your common sense moral reaction is don't kill this person. So you're not going to blow up the fat man, the innocent fat man, and thus you're not going to save the 20 people behind him from drowning. So the whole point, and this is a point I want to hammer home, he's offering two distinct examples here. The fat man in the cave and the magistrate in the mob example. He's illustrating or making two distinct philosophical points. Okay, the first example here, the fat man in the cave example, he's demonstrating, look, that we need to reflect. no matter what moral dilemma or moral situation we have in front of us, we always need to reflect. It's never good enough to just go with these. That's the problem with the bad guys. They just always go with these. Right? So point of the cave example, question your common sense moral intuitions or common sense moral reactions or common sense moral convictions. You always got to reflect further. Okay? So the case of the fat man in the cave is thought to show why, quote, we should beware our naturally conservative and unreflective moral reactions. He says that on 284. So we move on to the magistrate and the mob example. Totally different scenario. So what happens here? And I usually have somebody describe the situation. So I'll be the student, right, describing the situation. There's a crime that's committed. The magistrate doesn't know who committed the offense, but he has an unsavory character here that he can blame, right? So frame and suggest did it and then execute. And because what the issue is, right? There's a mob forming and they're going to riot because they're disgruntled about the crime that was committed and the fact that there's no justice being brought about. And so to sort of assuage or appease the mob, the magistrate can frame this this individual. And again, the individual has an unsavory character. Nobody would second guess. Right? The idea is nobody likes him and so on, so they go along with it. They would buy it basically. So should he frame this innocent individual, right, to stop the mob from rioting? The idea is that with the mob riots, they're going to destroy the town, presumably kill many innocent people in the process, and so on. And so what's the utilitarian or consequentialist suggest we ought to do? And this is where I can tell who actually did the reading and who didn't, because those who didn't do the reading are going to immediately assume right off the bat that it's the same sort of thinking. Well, stop the mob right away, right? And stop them from rioting and destroying the town and killing presumably many more innocent individuals. But actually, Nielsen says, well, hold up. The thoroughgoing utilitarian or consequentialist, the consistent one, they're not going to be so nearsighted, right? If they're good, they're going to have an eye towards long-term consequences as well. And hold on, right? Once we open our eyes towards the long-term consequences, if we do something that could jeopardize the entire justice system, like framing innocent individuals, that could yield a much greater evil if people were to find that out, right? I mean, the whole entire justice system would be compromised. Nobody would have any faith that in any of the people that are overseeing the justice system. So he says, in fact, in view of that possibility, right, a thoroughgoing consequentialist or utilitarian would decide in favor of not framing the innocent person. Right? So in this instance, again, what does the deontologist or moral absolutist or moral conservativist say the magistrate should do? Well, look, we shouldn't frame people, period. Right? They would have a rule or a standard like that. Don't frame people. It doesn't matter what the situation is. Don't execute innocent people. Don't frame innocent people. So the deontologists, the moral absolutists, the moral conservatives, they're going to say, the magistrate should not frame the innocent person. But again, it's never because they think it's going to result in better consequences. It's because they think that's the right thing to do, period. Doesn't matter what the circumstances in our experience are. Right? And in this situation, it happens to be the case that the consequentialist, the utilitarian, actually agrees, Nielsen says. But it's only after reflecting, okay? And that's the difference. There's always this difference. Even when they seem to suggest the same course of action, Nielsen's careful to point out, his side is still always reflecting, whereas these guys, the deontologists, the moral absolutists, the moral conservatives, they always just go with their common sense moral intuition right off the bat. Okay, now, the point, though, why is he bringing up this magistrate and the mob example? Well, he wants to point out, look, it would be weird, right, if a moral theory was always recommending things that were at odds with our gut, unreflective responses to situations, right? So if we were always like, what should I do here? And immediately thought, do this, and then the moral theory is telling us to do the opposite. Well, that would be cause for concern, right? Because that's what's happening in the cave example, right? Our immediate response is don't kill an innocent person, and then the utilitarians and consequentialists are telling us, well, actually, in this situation, kill that fat man because you're going to save a bunch of others. And so he's pointing out, right, well, it would be a little off-putting cause for concern if the moral theory was always at odds with kind of what we naturally thought we ought to do, right, our immediate reaction to situations. He's pointing out, well, look, through this magistrate and mob example, look, oftentimes actually the case that we'll recommend the same course of action. Right? Although it's always through reflection, proper reflection, we've always reflected, we'll end up recommending the same course of action 9 times out of 10 as our common sense moral reactions would have suggested we do in the first place. Okay, so that's the point of the mob example. Okay? You can be a utilitarian and consequentialist and not always be at odds with these common sense moral reactions. Okay? So with regard to this case, Nielsen argues, this is from 285, quote, and this is on slide 8, one can consistently remain a consequentialist and continue to accept common sense moral convictions, at least about most situations. Okay? Granted, you always reflect on them in this scenario. So again, unlike the fat man example, here in the magistrate and the mob example, our common sense moral reactions and consequentialism will recommend the same course of action, not frame an innocent person. I already mentioned that. So again, turning to slide 9, do keep in mind that even in those instances where they do align, and that will oftentimes be the case, the utilitarian or consequentialist is still always reflecting on this, right? Always reflecting on consequences of acting in accord with these. Okay? And in situations where the consequences would be far worse if we acted in accord with our common sense moral reaction to the situation, then we should abandon this, like in the fat man in the cave example. Abandon that common sense moral reaction that it's never okay to kill an innocent person. Because we have to in that situation, he wants to say. Okay. Going back to the mob example again, utilitarians, consequentialists, nevertheless, 90% of the time, or whatever it might be, end up recommending the same course of action. He says on 287, quote, the most crucial thing to recognize is that to regard such judicial bowing to such a threatening mob as unqualifiedly wrong, as morally intolerable, one need not reject utilitarianism and accept some form of theistic or deontological absolutism. Okay, so he's trying to suggest why, sort of defend the consequentialists and the utilitarians' view and show why they're not yielding or leading to monstrous implication. And he's actually going to flip the tables around and suggest you guys are the ones that actually lead us down the road to much worse consequences and much more intolerable implications, or however you want to put it. So this is slide 10. So the problem arises, and this is something, let's see, we'll go ahead and erase all this. So the gist of it, I don't want to spend too much time at this point talking about what this means, but I will mention it here because Nielsen references it, and he's right in doing so. But we will, so what I'm getting at is we will flesh this out and develop this idea in much more detail in lecture, is it 11 when we get to Kant, okay? Because Kant's going to expound on this idea of a priori reason in much more detail. So we'll save most of our discussion for this when we get to Kant. But he says, right, the issue with the deontologists, the moral absolutists, the moral conservatives, people like Kant, is that they view morality as being an a priori business. This is a Latin term. Okay. So, and again, we'll revisit this when we get to Kant. So real quick, what is this distinction? So what does he mean when he says the deontologists, the moral absolutists, the moral conservatives, they view morality as being an a priori sort of enterprise? This is a distinction about how we come to know what we know. Okay? So if something's knowable a priori, what that means is that it didn't require experience to be known. If something's knowable a posteriori, that means it required experience to be known. Okay, so they're both reflecting things that we know. The difference is in how we came to know whatever it was we knew. Okay, so now I should say that this very distinction reflects the distinction between, we've referenced this before at various times in different lectures. It's an epistemological distinction, empiricism. The rationalist and the empiricist. So I talked, for example, about John Locke, and I mentioned how he's one of the most well-known empiricists. He has the notion of tabula rasa, we're born with a blank slate. My point here is that empiricists like Locke, they're going to deny the very notion of this distinction, the very credibility of this distinction. They're going to suggest there is no such thing as a priori knowledge. Everything we know is a posteriori. everything we know required experience. Remember our discussion of that at the beginning of the Locke lecture? Okay, rationalism versus empiricism. A rationalist thinks that, hey, there's at least some types of knowledge that we can come to know without the aid of experience. Okay? And so Kant is a rationalist, right? Very much so. He thinks that there are things we can come to know a priori without needing to consult experience, and morality is one of those things. Everything we come to know about morality, in theory, the idea is, according to Kant and the deontologists, we can come to know by just reflecting, just putting on our thinking caps, going in the closet and just thinking. We can deduce all the moral standards that apply, absolutely, categorically, across all experience. We don't need to look at experience to figure out what we ought to do. Just through reflection, we can come to figure out what we ought to do. So that's what he's getting at here. So is experience required to figure out what we ought to do? Kant, the consequentialist, the utilitarians, Nielsen wants to say, yes, it is. Morality requires, we can't figure out what we ought to do without looking at experience. So morality is an a posteriori endeavor. It requires what we know about morality required experience. Whereas the Kant, the deontologist, the moral absolutist, the moral conservatist, and this is what he's saying is the problem with them, is they're viewing morality as if it's something that we can know without looking at experience at all. And that's why they say that things like that lying is always wrong, and that you always ought to never kill an innocent person, and things like that. Don't ever, knife throwing is always wrong. Telling lies is always wrong. Okay, that's because they don't look at experience in order to figure things out. He wants to say that's the problem with their theory. That's what leads them then to not blow a fat man out of a cave and let 20 others die instead. That's the problem. In proceeding this way, then they allow these terrible things to happen in their experience. Okay. So again, we will develop this in much greater detail when we get to Kant, but just wanted to put this on your radar. He is pointing to this and saying, Nielsen that is, pointing to this and saying, this is the problem with them, is that they're saying morality is knowable without looking at experience. But no, we always have to look at experience, being the act utilitarian. He's saying we always have to look at experience and figure out, given the scenarios, forming calculations if necessary, then figure out what we ought to do in the situation, given these empirical circumstances of our experience. And we can't just go into every situation applying these rational standards that we knew beforehand, as Kant and these other guys say. Okay, so along those lines, nice segue then to slide 11. These kinds of all-encompassing moral principles, they don't seem like they're always warranted. This is the top of slide 11. Don't, always tell the truth. Don't lie. Don't kill an innocent person, so on and so forth. And so he brings up this kind of quirky example. This wasn't included in the text that was in our textbook, but it's right around the same excerpt, very, very close to it. He points out, so, look, knife throwing is wrong. The utilitarians, the consequentialists, and the deontologists, moral absolutists, moral conservatives, they all say knife throwing is wrong. But what makes it wrong? How is it they come to know it's wrong? And this is where he wants to say the problem arises and, the differences. It's because for him, right, the consequentialists and utilitarians, it's because when we throw knives at each other, it hurts. People have to go to the hospital. They're in pain. They become miserable, depressed. Terrible consequences. That's what makes it wrong. But if that wasn't the case, if we had different types of bodies where, in fact, it didn't hurt for us to have knives winged at us, and in fact, it made us all happy to throw knives, then maybe the proper thing to do actually in that situation would be to throw knives at each other because we gained happiness from it. So he's saying that's an example, right? And I mentioned something similar when we were going through, why is lying wrong? When I first started distinguishing these two polar opposite views. I mentioned from the utilitarian's perspective, right? It's because on a whole, when people lie, the consequences are worse. But if we imagine a situation, if things were different, and if on a whole people were happier when people lied, then that would actually be the right thing to do. It wouldn't be the wrong thing to do. So he's got to look at experience, right? It's an a posteriori process. And then he says, so going back to the knife throwing example, this is the one he uses to make his point. He says, quote, if human beings had a kind of metallic exoskeleton, it would not be hurt, disfigured, or seriously inconvenienced by knives sticking in them, we would not, so evidently at least, have good grounds for saying knife throwing is wrong. You can't just say it's wrong, absolutely, right? What makes it wrong is that certain bad things happen when it happens, right? And we have to consult experience to figure that out. Right? If things were different, and again, how do we know that? Well, we have to look at experience. If things worked out differently, then maybe knife throwing wouldn't be wrong, or maybe telling lies wouldn't be wrong, or maybe killing an innocent person wouldn't be wrong, right? If 20 others are going to drown behind him if we don't kill him. So, likewise, quote, and again, this is in the same text, but not in the excerpt that is included in our textbook. He says, quote, "What is, as things are, morally intolerable, for example, the judicial killing of the innocent, need not be morally intolerable in all conceivable circumstances," end quote. So, for example, going back to the mob example, if we could ensure that that knowledge would never get out, in theory, right? Now, how would you ever ensure that? You probably couldn't, and that's the utilitarian in practice would probably always say you shouldn't ever frame anyone. But let's say in theory, right, you could somehow ensure that that knowledge would never leak out. Well, that changes things, right? Well, then maybe you should frame the innocent person if it's going to thwart the destruction of the entire town and killing of many more innocent people. Okay. What would Nielsen say about the hospital example? You know, again, if you're pushing this line of thought, which seems kind of convincing, this goes back to, what was it, the lecture 7, right, where we talked about the trolley and the hospital. At what point then, right, where does Nielsen stop, right? Why is it then not acceptable to then kill an innocent person in the hospital and use his or her organs to then save 5 other people that wouldn't have otherwise survived? Because most utilitarians I know, or consequentialists, don't want to commit to the hospital administrator having to do that, right? There seems to be something different about that. Well, what is it that's palpably different? You know, you're losing 5 people otherwise if you don't take that perfectly healthy individual, kill them, take his or her organs, give them to the 5 other people. You're going to lose 5 other people. What is the difference? So I'm always fascinated by that. You know, what would Nielsen? Because you know, so many of us are convinced. But you know, in the fat man in the cave example, well, that seems clearly the thing to do. So many people say. I'm not saying everyone by any means, but you know, blow the fat man up. So why not kill the innocent person in the waiting room of the hospital to save the other 5 people? Where is the difference? What is the difference? There is a difference because, or there seems to be a difference because when you poll people, as we talked about in lecture 7, you know, 80% or 90% or whatever are willing to blow the fat man up or pull the lever for the trolley dilemma, but they're not willing to kill the innocent person in the waiting room or push the guy over the bridge. Well, why? What is it that's appreciably different? Okay. So, in fact, this is the bottom of slide 11. The all-encompassing moral principles of deontology and our common sense moral convictions, at least if you always just unquestioningly go with them, they're the things that are problematic or monstrous, and that they allow, at least sometimes, a far greater evil to happen. 20 people to drown instead of blowing up the one innocent. As he says on 290 of our text, this is Nielsen, quote, "Letting him remain stuck while the whole group drowns is still more monstrous." They're the ones that yield monstrous implications. And this all reflects the utilitarian and consequentialist advocating this concept of negative responsibility. Oops. And this is actually what Bernard Williams, by the way, is going to have an issue with too. But the idea is that we're not, and I've alluded to this going, I think even way back to maybe lecture 5 in the middle lecture, that we're not only, the idea is we're not only responsible for the things we proactively bring about, but we're also responsible for the things we allow to happen that we could have prevented through action. So we're also responsible for our inactions. So Nielsen wants to say, through this concept of negative responsibility, we are responsible. We should be held accountable if we're in that situation, the cave example, and we don't blow the fat man up, right? We should be held accountable. We would have responsibility then because through our inaction, we allowed a much greater evil to happen. And by the way, while I'm thinking about it, one distinction I wanted to mention, I meant to mention this a long time ago, this is kind of an aside, that I think is important though, to kind of keep in mind through all these moral discussions is it's okay to be able to acknowledge instances where, you know, you think X is the right thing to do in the situation. And then to be able to admit at the same time, if I was in that situation, I don't think that's that I would be able to do it nonetheless. Or, it's one thing to say, well, if I was in this situation, this is what I ought to do. And then when you're actually in the situation, to do it, right? I mean, so those are two different things. And I think, a lot of us maybe would be willing to admit there are some instances where the right thing, what we think is the right thing to do, isn't necessarily something that we think ourselves capable of doing. So, for example, you might be in an agreement with Nielsen that the right thing to do in the Fat Man in the Cave example is to kill the innocent Fat Man, but then you might also admit at the same time, I could never personally kill him, though. I just couldn't bring myself to do it. Another similar situation would be like Sophie's Choice. I don't know, what was his name? William Styron? I don't remember who. I think it was whoever wrote it. Terrible scenario. This woman's basically like both of her kids were going to die unless she picks one of her kids. Unless she names one of her kids, they're both going to die. So you might, if you're a parent like me, I can't imagine a worse scenario. You might think, especially if you're utilitarian, right? Okay, you better name a child because one dying is better than two dying. And so you might be able to concede, well, the right thing to do would be to name one. But then, could you actually name one if you were in that situation? I don't know. I don't know if I could personally, right? So it's one thing to, and I think it's important, to acknowledge. It's one thing to discuss what we think we ought to do in a situation. It's another thing to discuss what we think we would, in fact, do in that situation. Okay, so maybe you are of the opinion that the proper thing to do in the Fat Man in the Cave example is kill the innocent Fat Man, but you yourself couldn't actually ever do it. Hopefully, the Fat Man is a thoroughgoing utilitarian himself, and we'll just have to hand him the dynamite, and he'll do it himself, right? Hopefully. Okay, so going along this idea of negative responsibility, again, this idea that you are equally responsible for the things you allow to happen through your inaction that you could have prevented. You're equally responsible for those kinds of things as you are for the things you actively bring about. Quote, this is from 290, is there anything more reasonable, more morally appropriate than choosing the lesser evil when doing or allowing some evil cannot be avoided? Look, somebody's dying in this situation, he wants to say. We don't love killing an innocent person. It's only something we do as a last resort. Is there anything, he wants to say, more reasonable than ensuring only one dies instead of 20? So he thinks it's way more inhumane, more morally monstrous of the deontologists to, quote, allow even more death and misery and then excuse themselves on the ground that they did not intend the death and misery but merely forbore to prevent it. Okay, so all this, again, appeals to this idea of negative responsibility, which, and this is, I like the way that they defined it in my previous textbook, is this idea, quote, that we are responsible not only for the consequences of our actions, but also for the consequences of our non-actions. Wrapping up here, this is a summary, the last slide, if you will, before the intermission. So, slide 13, real quick review. What was the point of the two examples? Again, the case of the magistrate and the mob, he's making two distinct points here. So, on the quiz, if you're addressing these, what Nielsen's up to, be sure to differentiate what he's up to. Why is he offering the Fat Man in the Cave example? Why is he offering the magistrate and the mob example? The magistrate and the mob example is thought to show how consequentialists can, quote, reasonably square their normative ethical theories with an important range of common sense moral convictions, end quote. That's on 288. Okay, so again, the idea was it would be weird if a moral theory was constantly prescribing us to do things that were at odds with how we naturally, unreflectively felt about the situation. So he's saying, just like that magistrate example, 9 times out of 10, even after reflecting, right, we're going to end up recommending, the utilitarian and the consequentialist, recommending the same course of action as those common sense moral reactions would have suggested we acted. Okay. So the case of the Fat Man in the Cave, on the other hand, is giving us, it's illustrating why we always have to reflect further, no matter what, though. Right? We can't just go unquestioningly with our common sense moral reactions. Okay? Because if we do, then we'll shirk our negative responsibility and sometimes do things through our inaction that allow far greater evil. So I shouldn't say do things. Fail to do things excuse me, and through our inaction, allow a far greater evil to happen. Right. So the case of the fat man illustrates why we need to always reflect. Right. Reflect. Think. Okay? About the situation. He's an act utilitarian. You have to analyze the situation, all the circumstances, scenario. Okay, and then, if it's permittable, given that reflection, then go ahead and act on the common sense moral reaction. But if it's like the fat man in the cave example, excuse me, where if you follow the common sense moral intuition, you're going to allow 20 other people to die instead of one, then you'd be doing the wrong thing. Okay, so reflect. That was the point of the fat man in the cave example. Page 289, quote, that a normative ethical theory is incompatible with some of our moral intuitions does not refute the normative theory. Excuse me. So he's pointing out there that just because his moral theory is at odds with some of our common sense moral reactions doesn't mean his theory is wrong, right? It means, here's some water. It means that our common sense moral reactions might be wrong, at least sometimes. Okay? Hence, we always have to reflect on them. Okay, that is Kai Nielsen and what he has to say. A lot of interesting, I think, examples. I always like teaching this in the discussions that follow. So what do you think about his two cases? This is the intermission. What should we do in those two cases? Right? What should we do? Would you blow the fat man up? Do you think that's what we ought to do? Would you be able to do it? And what about the magistrate example? What do you think Nielsen would say about the trolley dilemmas? Right, both versions. And then not only that, what about the hospital scenario? Okay. Given what Nielsen's saying, what do we think he would say about the hospital scenario? Again, I have a hard time imagining a utilitarian, actually endorsing the idea that we should kill a perfectly healthy individual in a waiting room to then save 5 others that wouldn't otherwise make it. But what's the difference? Like I said, so that's all at play here with number 2. And then I like number 3 here too. That's always interesting discussion in class too. Does our government operate according to utilitarian principles? So in theory and or in practice. So maybe you're of the mindset, well, the way they structured it, our founding fathers, in theory, right, the government's supposed to be sort of utilitarian, right? But then in practice, it never ends up working out that way, right? Or maybe you want to say in practice it tends to be that way, but in theory it wasn't supposed to be so utilitarian, right? Or maybe you want to say it's not utilitarian in either sense, or it's utilitarian in both senses. So, what is the relationship between utilitarianism and how our governments run, both theory and in practice? What do you make of that? So those are the questions. When we get back for the second part of the lecture, we'll focus more on Bernard Williams then and his idea of moral integrity and talk about why he thinks the utilitarians, their emphasis on negative responsibility and whatnot, and requiring us to do any evil at all, granted it's a lesser evil, why requiring us, demanding that we do an evil, right, doing something that at times we feel very strongly at our core, very strongly against, how that's then at odds, he thinks. It violates what he calls our moral integrity. Again, he thinks it's going to be, it fails to afford individuals enough respect. Right? It fails to respect our moral integrity. That's going to be Williams, though. That's what we'll look forward to in the second part of the lecture. Until then, I hope you enjoyed this one. Thanks.